Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the 15th Annual Human Rights in Asia Conference. My name is Imawa Muñoz Carrasco, and with my colleague, Erika Regalado, we will be your conference presenters today. As human rights advocates, it is our utmost pleasure to be part of this meaningful event hosted by the Human Rights Center at the University of Essex. We express our sincerest gratitude to all of you who have taken the time to join us today, wherever you may be. We will also like to extend our appreciation to the conference speakers and members of Essex Law School who have joined us to support this important cause. Just a quick reminder, this entire session will be recorded and uploaded to the Human Rights Center YouTube channel for future viewing. We encourage you to interact with our speakers and fellow attendees through the chat and the Q&A function, where you may ask questions at any time. Rest assured that all questions will be collected and answered by the speakers at a later time. If you have any other questions or concerns, please don't hesitate to reach out to any of our conference team members through private messaging. Each of us is identified with the conference team tag in our names. Now, we would like to officially welcome you all to the 15th Annual Human Rights in Asia Conference. This edition is about the human rights impacts of the fashion industry in Asia. In this first session, we will go over the working conditions of garment workers in Asia and living wages and their impact on economic, social, and cultural rights. To provide you with a brief introduction to this initiative at the Human Rights Center, we would like to invite Dr. Sanae Fujita, lead of the conference, and Dr. Andrew Fagan, director of the center, to share a few words. Dr. Fujita and Dr. Fagan, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I think it's probably appropriate if I just say the first few words before handing over to Dr. Fujita. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, wherever you may be joining us. I see there's a significant number of people in the participant box, so thank you for giving up your time for today and indeed for next Saturday, because this is a conference, as you may know, that occurs over two successive Saturday mornings. I just wanted to say a few words about the significance of this particular venture for the Human Rights Center. We have been supporting this largely student organized and student motivated initiative and conference now for some 14 or 15 years, which is a very impressive track record. We've done so ultimately because Asia remains, despite being the most populous continent on Earth, remains a largely overlooked and at times marginalized concern for human rights theorists and human rights practitioners, despite the continuing power of China and, of course, other important issues in that particular region. So this is a conference which is largely organized by our students, by a student team who devote a great deal of time behind the scenes throughout several months, actually, shortly after joining us here at Essex in their studies. They embark upon this particular work. So huge respect and huge recognition to the student organizing team who have made this possible. Also, just before I leave, I really do have to stress the importance of Dr. Sanae Fujita's impetus and passion and commitment to this particular project. Dr. Fujita has been a driving force since its very beginning, since the very first conference, and throughout the successive 14 or 15 conferences. Sanae, I lose track. There've been so many. I think we're at 15 now. Sanae has been an absolute driving force to make this happen every single year. So this year we are focusing upon a topic which I'm sure is deeply pertinent to all of us. Who does not wear clothes ultimately that have now or at some point during our lives that have not been produced in Asia under often very dubious human rights violating conditions. So this is a really important personal and, of course, highly kind of topical issue. I look forward to the discussions that are occurring this week and next week. And again, just to reiterate the appreciation that we want to show, the Human Rights Center shows to the student organizing team and to Dr. Fujita. Sanae, enough from me. You're the main star here, so over to you.
Supervising this from the beginning of this conference every year. First of all, I'd like to thank the speakers to spend time to prepare talk and attend this Saturday. And I appreciate all the participants from all over the world. And welcome. And I appreciate all the support from the Essex University, Human Rights Center, and School of Law. And I really want to congratulate the hard work to the conference team. And And before we start, I like to briefly introduce this conference, how we start and the background, how important it is. Yeah, I hope now it's okay. Yeah. This is an annual conference and a student-led conference, and it is called a flagship event of the Essex Human Rights Center. So this past, we have a homepage and the Essex Human Rights page, Center's homepage. So the final report of the past years are available. So if you're interested, please go to this page. And as Andrew said, this is the most populated region in the world. Asia has a more population than the rest of the world inside of this circle. So we have a lot of human rights problem. However, the commitment of the Asia government to the human rights is not very good. This is the ratio of the ratification of the major human rights treaties. But as you see, compared with other regions, Asia is not doing very good job. On the other hand, in Essex Human Rights course, we don't have a particular module focusing on human rights in Asia issue. So in 2009, some MA and LM students from Asia raised a voice, and we started student-led conference of Asia. The first year was very small, and the participant speakers are all from Essex University, but we continued that second year and third year, and by degree, the conference became bigger and bigger, and we had more speakers from out many places and the attendance. So in each year, the student team chose very topical and timely, important topics. And we invited very prominent speakers from each topics each year. But from 2020, because of pandemic, we switched to the online event. So it is a bit shame not to be able to meet each other in the venue. But on the other hand, we can invite people from all over the world. That's a very good point. So this is the 15th year. This is today and next week. And the conference teams is these 6 students. And from the beginning of this meeting, we had the first meeting October. And since then, these students hard work very, very hard. And I really want to congratulate you hard work. And all the participants, please enjoy today. And don't forget to register. This is first day, and the next Saturday is another conference day. So please register that as well. So from me, that's all. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Dr. Fujita, Dr. Fagan, for their opening remarks. Now it is our privilege to introduce our distinguished guests for today's session. So for the first segment, we have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Obokata Tomoya, a renowned Japanese scholar of international human rights law, specialized in transnational organized crime, human trafficking, and modern slavery. He currently serves as the UN Special Rapporteur on contemporary forms of slavery and is a professor of international human rights law at York Law School. Dr. Obokata has collaborated with various stakeholders and has published extensively on these topics. Without further delay, it is our honor to invite Dr. Obokata to deliver the keynote speech addressing the conference theme as a whole. Dr. Obokata, the floor is yours, please.
Great. Well, thank you very much. I'm trying to share my screen. I hope that's it's working. Yes. Great. Well, first of all, thank you very much to the committee, student committee, for inviting me. And as you might know, I graduated from Essex long time ago, back in at late 90s. So it's always nice to come back, even virtually, to Essex. So thank you for this invitation. And this year's topic is quite important to my mandate as a UN Special Rapporteur on contemporary forms of slavery, because the working condition, in many cases, the workers do suffer from gross violations of human rights, which may amount to, for example, slavery, forced labor, or servitude. So I, would like to take this opportunity to explain some of the issues that I see in this particular region. So this is the brief outline of my talk today. The first, I thought I would explain some of the definitions of various forms of exploitation, because certain terms are kind of used interchangeably, and it makes it quite confusing. So I thought I would explain those. And then I will discuss international standards on working conditions, particularly the International Covenant on International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. And then I will kind of briefly illustrate some of the examples of how the fashion industry is in compliance with international standards, including the state's obligation. So I hope that my talks is going to be clear to you. Then then I'll be very happy to answer any question at a later stage. So please keep those until later. Now, let's start with the definitions with slavery. Now, what do we mean by that? The key instrument is the Slavery Convention 1926. Now, this is a very old international legal instrument which has been universally ratified. And you can also see elements of it in various treaties, in International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and also regional treaties, as well as the ICC statute. According to that, the slavery is defined as a status or condition of a person over whom any or all of powers attaching to the right of ownership are exercised. Now, the key in this definition is the powers attached to the right of ownership. Now, it is wrong to say now that people can be owned because the slavery has been universally abolished in law, that is, but in practice, in certain parts of the world, such as the Sahel region of Africa, the master-slave relationship still continues in certain communities and societies. But what do we mean by powers attached? And basically, we refer to control or coercion over a person's autonomy, restriction on the freedom of movement, lack of consent, threat or use of physical and psychological violence, and abuse of power and authority. So this is what we mean by powers attaching to over individuals. Next, we have another conduct known as servitude. Now, the international law doesn't really define what we mean by servitude, but it is stipulated, as you might know, in instruments, including the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the European Convention on Human Rights. Now, according to the European Court, a servitude is a particularly serious denial of liberty. And the European Court gave an example of where the people are coerced to provide services and live on another's property. So it is quite similar to slavery. So examples of servitude here include debt bondage, that is to say that people are indebted to the debtor, and that they have to keep paying their debt back for various reasons, but that doesn't really happen. So some of these people are in a semi-permanent situation, so they have to work almost for free and keep paying their debts to their masters and so on. And serfdom, that also happens in the context of agriculture, where people are forced to live on the landowner, and they cultivate and produce agricultural goods, but rarely get paid. Domestic servitude is a kind of a domestic work. So you serve as a servant for people's homes. So that's domestic servitude. And servile and child marriage. If you are, even if you are not actually working, and if you are in that type of situation, yes, that may be regarded as servitude. Next, we have forced labor. The key instrument there is the Forced Labor Convention in 1930, which I am, authorized by the Human Rights Council to spread these instruments across the globe as part of my mandate. Now, according to that, the forced labor is regarded as all work or service which is exacted from any person under the menace of any penalty, or for which the said person has not offered himself voluntarily. So that is a basic definition. So what do we mean by threat of any penalty? Here, once again, we are talking about coercion, violence, isolation, or restriction of movement. The involuntary nature refers to lack of consent on the part of workers. Now, there's a difference. So what is the difference between the servitude and forced labor? Because all of these elements are quite similar. Now, so in the case of servitude, there is a feeling that their conditions are permanent. So they feel that, this is going to continue for the rest of my life. So that's what we mean by servitude, where forced labor is slightly less than that. So on the scale of things, the slavery constitutes the most severe form of restriction or control over individual, and then moving down to scale of servitude and forced labor, if you understand what I mean. And finally, we also have this conduct called trafficking in persons. This is defined under the protocol to prevent, suppress, and punish trafficking in persons attached to the UN Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime. Now, it provides a rather long definition of trafficking, and obviously, some of us lawyers get really excited about looking at long definitions and trying to digest what it means. But for the purpose of my talk today, I thought I would identify 3 key elements of trafficking. The first of which is action element. In criminal law terms, it is also known as actus reus. So it's a conduct of trafficking. So that is to recruit, transfer, harbor, or receive. So that is the act of trafficking. The second element is known as means element. So someone is recruited with the use of coercion, deception, abuse of power, position of vulnerability, and giving and receiving and payment. So you again once start seeing some of the core elements of coercion, deception, in trafficking definition as well. And finally, we have a purpose element of labor or sexual exploitation. So these people were trafficked for them to be exploited in the sex industry or in various forms of forced labor in a destination country. But it's important to highlight that this third element is a mental element rather than an action element. So one does not have to be exploited for an offense of trafficking to be established. What is important is what was in the mind of trafficker. So as long as a trafficker was intending for victims to be exploited, and the trafficking offense is complete. In criminal law terms, we call this as an offense of ulterior intent, similar to an offense of burglary. For the burglary offense, you do not have to actually steal something. As soon as you enter into a premise with an intention of stealing, the offense is complete. So it is quite similar to that. Now, so these are the key definitions of some of the offenses that I'm in charge of within my mandate as UN Special Rapporteur on contemporary forms of slavery. And now I'd like to move on to discuss some of the key human rights standards, particularly Article 7 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. We all know what the general comments are, and the most important one here is general comment number 23, which touches upon the just and favorable conditions of work. And according to that, right to the just and favorable condition of work is a right for everyone. So here, the principle of non-discrimination is quite important. As you might know, non-discrimination is an obligation of immediate effect, even though it is stipulated under the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. And then in this document, the committee goes on to explain some of the key concepts, first of which is remunerations. Here we're talking about wages and social security contributions. The key there is obviously the equality. So everyone has to get paid an equal amount of wages and or social security contribution, regardless of their gender, nationality, migration status, religious beliefs, and political opinions, and so on. And then another important element is living versus minimum wages. I know that my co-panelists will be discussing that in detail, but there's a distinct difference. It is not nowadays enough to provide a minimum wage because of the inflation and so on. So there is that idea of living wages and the sufficient salary that you need to survive on a day-to-day basis. But I'll leave that to my fellow panelists. And other key elements are safe and healthy working conditions. Here we are talking about things such as prevention of occupational accidents and diseases. And the states must pay due regards to gender, dimension, and that raises an important issue in terms of like disease and accidents, as well as workers with disabilities. And so, again, we need to pay attention to the diversity of workforce and provide an appropriate working conditions and prevent disease. And if in a case of disease or illness, the victim should be entitled to access justice and remedies, and that's part of the obligation. Another element is access to safe drinking water and sanitation in the workplace. And finally, we also have paid sick leave. So if you're on sick, the companies should provide sick leave, and that should also be mandated in national legislation. A few other elements are equal opportunity for promotion, particularly for women in various sectors, including the fashion industry. Again, women gets paid less than men for the exact same amount of work, and that obviously is a clear breach of Article 7 of the Covenant. And rest, leisure, working hours, and paid holidays. They, according to the Committee on Economic and Social and Cultural Rights, it specifies that daily limit has to be 8 hours per day. So in theory, then, if someone is working more than 8 hours, that is a clear breach of this particular article. But there are certain overtime and so on, but overtime pay should be provided if someone has to work longer than 8 hours. And it also specifies the daily rest period, such as lunch or toilet breaks, that has to be provided. I mean, these things are quite common sense, isn't it? But I mean, the fact that these are not provided kind of suggests that these needs to be provided as part of the international standard. The next one, weekly rest days, minimum 1 day, 2 days desirable. So once a week, you have to have a full day without having to work. And finally, paid annual leave must be provided by companies, and again, should be stipulated ideally in the national legislation. And according to the committee, 2 weeks should be regarded as minimum. So if someone is only getting less than that, that seems to me is a clear breach of this obligation. And finally, just a couple more: flexible working arrangement. Now, we kind of came to appreciate this flexible working arrangement, particularly in light of the COVID-19 pandemic. But that should also be respected. So, for example, particularly female workers, if they have a family or children to look after, or workers with disabilities who may have different needs in terms of their physical and mental capacity, and older workers. So the companies have to kind of take these, them into consideration and provide an appropriate working arrangement. And finally, freedom from harassment and violence is crucial. So that also certainly includes sexual harassment and violence. So these are the key international standards as stipulated by the International Covenant on Economic and Social Cultural Rights. But I just wanted to touch upon additional instrument. Now, this is not a legally binding instrument, but many of you probably have heard of this one, the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. And these are very important to my mandate as the UN Special Rapporteur as well, because the majority of the people are exploited by companies. And I am in a position to work with all businesses, wherever they are, to make sure that they are in compliance of these guiding principles. And so these constitute a set of principles for businesses to uphold, including work-related rights. And it highlights the need for human rights to due diligence. I think many of you have heard what this is. And it is a process of identifying, preventing, mitigating, and accounting for the negative, actual or possible negative impacts of business operations on human rights. So each business would have to take in all of these, identify risks and prevent and mitigate. And in case of breach, the companies should provide remedies to affected workers. So this is a kind of a guiding principles on business and human rights, which are quite important. So now I'd like to move on to look at some of the concrete examples of what I have seen from my own experience of, for example, country visits in Asia, Sri Lanka, and through my thematic report on this issue. Now, just a brief overview, statistical overview. According to the latest estimates by International Labour Organization, Walk Free Foundation, which is a CSO, the civil society organization, as well as International Organization for Migration, 50 million people are held in modern slavery on any given day. Now, this is an increase by at least 10 million because the last estimates back in 2016 said about 40 million people are held. So it is actually have increased, which is, from my point of view and from your point of view, is quite disturbing. And 27.6 million are held in forced labor, and whereas the other half almost are in forced and child marriage. Asia and the Pacific, you can see more victims of forced labor, 15.1 million. So this region is affected by modern slavery the most compared to Europe, Africa, Latin America, or the Americas, or the Middle East. I don't know if you find that quite surprising or not, but the modern slavery affects Asia and the Pacific more than any others. And the prevalence of debt bondage is very high in the garment or fashion industry. So again, the workers, particularly women, because we need to, again, highlight the gendered nature of this particular work, because the majority of the workforce are women. So that raises lots of important issues in terms of obligations of states as well as businesses. But there you go. So let's look at that. So I talked about some of the standards. So let's take a look at actual examples in terms of wages. It is obvious that there is a clear gender pay gaps. According to ILO, this is back in 2016, so it was slightly older information, but I suspect this still is the case. It was highest in Pakistan, followed by India, Thailand, Philippines, Vietnam, Cambodia, Indonesia, Laos, and Bangladesh. So for the same or even more, longer hours of work, women get paid less. And I actually have seen that when I visited Sri Lanka 2 years ago, and I visited the garment industry. There, obviously, the majority of the workforce are women, and they're the clear gender pay gap. And there's also pay gaps for migrant workers and workers with disabilities and children and young people. The companies do not treat them as proper workers. So what happens? I mean, migrant workers, because their legal status, they cannot complain. If they do, and they will be fired. And so you have that kind of a threat, either direct threat, sometimes they are threatened by their factories, or indirect threat. So they cannot really complain even if they want to, because they also have a family to support back home. So they are in that type of situation, workers with disabilities, because they're regarded as less productive, which I think is a huge mistake. And children and young people, because they are easy to influence. Children are not going to know what minimum wages are, as long as they have some money to buy sweets, for example. They could be easily deceived. But unfortunately, that's a very disturbing picture there. And less than minimum wage, and in many cases, there's nowhere near living wages in various parts of the country, and that needs to be highlighted. Once again, I hope that my fellow panelists will be able to highlight some of these in detail. And unsafe and unhealthy working conditions, and that applies to a certain, many industries, including manufacturing and agriculture, but that is equally the same for the fashion and garment industry, because that's the regular accidents because of they have to operate machines and things like that. Exposure to toxic substances, chemicals they may have to use to produce clothes and so on. And during the pandemic, spread of COVID-19 was regarded as particularly serious among the garment industry, and because of for example, the crowded space. They are forced to work because garment industry was regarded as essential in many parts of the world, and particularly, for example, the production of PPE and things like that as part of that. So therefore, many people are certainly have been fired during the lockdown, but other people were forced to work longer hours in crowded places without ventilation and access to water and sanitation. And as I said, if you are sick, you should be paid, you should be entitled to sick leave in theory, but in practice, that doesn't happen in many cases. I've seen, so for example, workers threatened in Sri Lankan garment industry with deduction of wages. So they'll tell you, okay, fine, you can take a sick leave, but that you are not covered, so your wages will be deducted. So if you are told that, what can you do really? I mean, again, if you're poor, if you have a family to support, so in many cases, these workers are forced to work even if they are ill. And that I think is, once again, provides a kind of a very upsetting and disturbing picture. And promotion, I mean, forget about it. There's this huge discrimination based on gender, ethnicity, migration status, or disability, and so on. It is more likely factory owners who are men, or management, most of which men. And that also happened in, for example, Sri Lanka, that a board of directors, the vast majority men and only one female director. There's something wrong in that picture. And obviously promotion, forget about it. If you're female, you're not likely to get promoted sooner than your male counterparts, your male colleagues. And there's also an intersectional form of discrimination, such as ethnicity, sexual orientation, migration status, and so on. And many workers are constantly discriminated against in this situation. And rest, leisure, and working hours and paid holidays. Again, very low working hours with little or no breaks. Because oftentimes in this fashion or garment industry, what they do is they provide higher targets. So they have to produce 20, 30 skirts within an hour. And if you don't meet that, then your wages are deducted. So that forces them to work long hours. And frankly, many of the female workers I met say, I can't go to toilet break because if I do, I cannot meet the target. Again, access to, in all of these that I told you earlier are not actually being applied. And there's no overtime pay. Once again, many workers are being threatened. And paid holiday in theory, but not in practice. And one of the, again, the more recent example I heard is this garment factory in Thailand, in a border area between Myanmar and Thailand. Obviously, many of these garment factories are staffed with Burmese workers, and I understand that they're forced to work 90 hours a week. 90 hours a week. I mean, imagine that. And then you're getting less than the minimum wage. I mean, that is a clear, it is a forced labor. Clear cut. And I encouraging thing though is that the workers have now instituted a legal action against the parent company, which actually happens to be Tesco's in UK. So now Tesco's being used because one of the subsidiaries are producing clothing for that particular company. And finally, harassment, threats, and violence, and that can happen. I'm not saying these are widespread, but in either subtle form or in more kind of obvious forms of verbal and physical violence, including those of sexual nature. And this affects the major workforce in the garment industry, which, as I said, women. Sexual harassment, sexual violence, in exchange for higher wages. I mean, I've heard stories like that, and again, it's totally not acceptable. From the human rights point of view. And a few more, I hope I'm not overstepping the time limit, but there are a few more issues I wanted to highlight. First of which is a shrinking civic space, that is to say activities of civil society organizations. Trade unions and workers' organizations are restricted by states and businesses themselves. The law may guarantee that, but businesses do not work cooperatively with trade unions. And in a region like Middle East, they don't even recognize the right to organize or bargain. And it's a problem. And workers should be empowered to be able to negotiate their working conditions. That's an essential part of their human rights, but that doesn't happen in practice. And there are impacts of external events such as COVID-19 or increasingly climate change, which can lead to unemployment without alternative opportunities or deteriorating working conditions, which may amount to forced labor, servitude, or slavery. So sometimes working conditions can be affected by these events, and certainly like others may include humanitarian crisis, natural disasters, and armed conflicts. And all of the external events can have an impact on the right to just and favorable conditions of work. So some of the key conclusions then is that, first of all, the working conditions in the fashion industry in Asia require improvement in various countries. And states must do more through legislative and other means to improve the status quo. And many, countries do have legislation, but they're not necessarily enforced because of the power relation between the companies. At least they're providing jobs. And if you enforce those laws strictly, then companies may pull out, and that may have an impact in terms of employment opportunities. And finally, implementation of human rights due diligence by companies is more important than ever. It is not just a state obligation, but companies must do more, and they must be held accountable legally and otherwise when they breach the workers' right to just and favorable conditions of work. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'll be very happy to answer any question later. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Obokata, for your illuminating keynote speech on the differences of all of these concepts and the current state of modern slavery and human trafficking. As we continue our discussion, we now turn our attention to the important issue of working conditions for garment workers in Asia. Our next speaker, Ms. Kate Larsen, brings over 17 years of expertise in responsible sourcing and supply chain management to the table. Kate is the founding director of Supply Exchange. Additionally, she has held positions such as the first Asia Corporate Responsibility Manager for Burberry and the Global Director of Responsibility Sourcing for TCP, the largest children's wear retailer in North America. We are honored to have her here with us today to share her insights on this pressing matter. Ms. Larsen, the floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. Really great to be here, and fantastic that everyone's so interested in this, because as Dr. Obokata pointed out, this is incredibly important still, despite it's actually 20 years of myself working on this and so many others before me. And 11 years of that was in Asia. So 你们好, 大家好, 大家好, konnichiwa to everybody. I miss Asia, but it's great to get to connect with more people who care about the people who make our things, and especially our clothes and shoes, etc. These photos here are photos I took in Cambodia. They're not just pulled from somewhere. This is the sort of thing you can see every day. Women in particular, as Dr. Obokata pointed out, still travel to work in garment factories like this on the back of trucks, which is horrific and, is an even further breach of human rights. So it shows how much work we have to do on these issues. Now you can see what I was talking about, which is the ladies in Cambodia who have been making your clothes, traveling to work on the back of trucks, to work in factories like this, and some people I was working with in Cambodia. And this is just a bit about me, but you're probably better off looking on LinkedIn, because really this is just a standard slide I sometimes show, that I've been doing a lot of this work for a long time. Of relevance here would be in Human Rights Watch on garment worker conditions, but actually what's really useful to the audience is that I've worked in brands, as was said. So going into a lot of factories, talking in Chinese to Chinese workers, both in China, but also in Japan, where they were in the bonded labor conditions that Dr. Obokata described, and with them for many different brands, and then on other issues these days in the media. And these are some of my team in Asia who I work with these days, who help me understand, who really I want to elevate their expertise of what's really going on the ground, but translate that to finance people and others in London who have influence over fashion and other companies. So that's what I do. So what are we worried about here? So some top tips I have on these issues to take away, because I want this to not just be what is the problem, but what are some solutions. So be aware and care. So you are here understand the new laws coming through, because as Dr. Obokata pointed out, they have power to help us cause these improvements towards living wage and enforced labor, etc. I want to share the power of collaboration, of integrity in that human rights due diligence work that the UN guiding principles expect, that there's rewarding of suppliers who do that work as well, and of companies who do that work with their suppliers, and that we all speak up to cause these laws with that focus on integrity that respects worker voice in particular. Where's my button? Okay. So Dr. Obokata talked about forced labor, and I wanted to touch on this a bit because maybe if I jump a screen for a second, and I'm going to come back, really, oops, sorry, I'll come back in a second. Oh dear, there's a slide I thought I'd put right up front. My apologies. Where is it? Okay. Yeah, you can hear. No, okay, my slide has disappeared, so I will just use these ones. So on modern slavery, as Dr. Obokata pointed out, it's been increasing, and the context for that, I call it a human rights deterioration. He called it a closing of civil society or challenges for civil society, but coupled with the need for migration due to climate change, due to other disasters, people are vulnerable, they need a job. So think of a Bangladeshi person whose village may be facing the impacts of climate change. We've seen factories, particularly fashion factories, shut down in COVID, and now people are in dire straits, and an agent says, here's a job for you in Malaysia on these great terms. And Malaysia is, to my second bullet, for example, is a country that's more reliant on these foreign workers these days to make also garments, but also electronics and other products. And my third point there, that after COVID, orders were cut. This is something everybody needs to understand, that the fashion industry overall did a pretty bad job. There were a few players who did pay their suppliers, but many Western brands just cut, and not just Western, but also Japanese, Korean, Chinese, etc., cut orders with their suppliers in South Asia in particular, leaving workers in destitution. So that means that people need to make up that difference. And so we have this context at the bottom of the ladder of forced labor before we even think about improving to minimum wage, and then living wage as well up the ladder. So that's our context. As Dr. Obokata pointed out, it's a worsening, being a worsening situation, but here we all are to do things about that. So what you also need to understand is that forced labor, modern slavery, and also most labor violations in a garment supply chain, you can't see them. You can walk around a factory and it might look beautiful, clean and tidy, but to an untrained eye, you're not going to see the violations of workers' human rights. So you can't see that a worker paid fees to get a job. You will rarely be able to see that there are restrictions on movement. You have to ask, you have to have confidential, safe interviews for workers to be able to talk about these things. And that's the sort of thing I used to arrange with my Asia colleagues and experts across the region, offsite whenever possible, by NGO or worker rights focused organizations. That's what I mean by this integrity in the work. And you can't, again, see that passports and papers are being held, although we knew in my time of frequently traveling to Japan that at the time was very common for foreign workers from China, these days from Vietnam, and it is in many countries, has been in many countries, and here in the UK even, and that wages might have been delayed by a month or more. We used to see a lot of cases of that sort of thing. And even we used to have to fight when Dr. Obokata talked about remediation for that, influencing passports being returned, lockers being provided so workers have access to them safely themselves, that they're allowed to leave their factory, that fees got returned. And we would even advocate and push our suppliers and licensee partners and others that workers got access to internet and phones when they were foreign contract workers. So we can take what looks pretty horrific and influence that things get improved to no longer forced labor and to conditions that if you get fees repaid, for example, we're helping to make a difference on the issue of poverty, for example. In the worst cases, as Dr. Obokata referenced, you might hear of threats of violence against contract workers who are leaving, and that's where we call it modern slavery. These factors are what play into modern slavery. So as we pointed, so this is a really great video if anybody has not seen it by the ILO. It's about 2 minutes long, which gives you a really good example. So it's focused on the construction industry, but you could actually just think garment factory in the same situation and look that up, lured by a job, or my presentation might be available afterwards. I talked about be aware and care. Be aware of what? I don't need to say too much because Dr. Obokata said this, which is that unfortunately, in most of the experience of those of us who look pretty hard in supply chains, have that integrity to dig deeper, very few workers are being paid all the legal minimum rates and overtime rates. And even in so-called better factories, that means that workers are often living in slums or in pretty poor dormitories. I used to go in and out of in China a lot, for example. And it also, all of these issues around brands not paying their suppliers enough contribute to that issue and safety issues. You see here the Rana Plaza collapse. I hope that any of you who are studying the issue of Asia and the fashion or apparel industry will be aware of and study and understand that this collapse happened. 1,200 workers died. It was one building with many factories making for over 30 brands in 2012. And that's really been an impetus for increased focus on this sector and the safety issue. So be aware and care about the issue that we buyers and brands have not been paying enough for factories to pay their workers enough to have safer buildings, to not need to pollute. Although we also need to make sure that when we do pay enough, that really does go to that remediation of those issues. Towards that, most big brands these days in the fashion sector will have social standards and ethical trading policy or a social compliance policy. And generally these are drawn from a couple of, from the ILO conventions, firstly, and international human rights standards, and then simplified down into sort of business language that we can share with our suppliers in the supply chain. And the UK Ethical Trading Initiative, so the ETI here is the UK-based version of that. And it also references living wage. And then there's other initiatives such as the Social Labor Convergence Project of the apparel fashion industry. Fair Wear is a fantastic initiative to really study and be aware of. And in the USA, the Fair Labor Association. So my other message here is to be aware and care by aligning standards, joining forces, and investigating properly and thinking about that wage ladder going from forced labor to remediation and living wage and poverty alleviation. Sorry, my button. Okay, it's a bit more about that collaborating. So what we find in supply chains is suppliers want to hear that brands are aligning their standards because they're busy trying to make the product and the workers are busy trying to make the product, and they don't want 10 different standards coming at them because most factories are making for multiple brands and buyers and agents to other brands and buyers. And that alignment helps cut cost and overlap. And in particular, aligning on the assessing, I used to do a lot of, I would be representing one brand and we would also go in and assess with somebody from Nike and from Marks and Spencer and from another brand and align our audits and then our beyond audit work of engaging and influencing remediation, introducing trainings to suppliers or to workers even, introducing worker helplines, etc. So don't duplicate. This is something we've learned in the past 20 years that the fashion sector needs to do to help cause human rights. And you'll see that referenced in the UN guiding principles and in the OECD guidance and these other legal guidance for business on how we deliver human rights in not just fashion, but all global supply chains. And these are some tools here around how we align. The ILO Better Work program is a fantastic example of, in Cambodia, Vietnam, Indonesia, many countries, how we work together on assessing together. And then that information is transparent and public. And then the Bangladesh Accord, or the Accord on Fire and Building Safety, is one that I hope any of you would support if you move forward in this industry, because again, that's been a solution to cause safer factories, that remediation that we want for human rights. It's expanded now from Bangladesh to Pakistan, and we hope it goes to more countries. And in that collaboration, we get to listen and learn and act and share. So I'm excited to see a colleague here speaking shortly from the Asia Floor Wage Alliance, because those are the sorts of organizations who we love coming together with and learning so much from each other with. So I talk here about stakeholder insights because NGOs know, trade unions, etc. And Clean Clothes Campaign being the one in Europe who help people like young people, especially like yourself, to learn more about these issues. I talked about the on-site integrity. So what we're talking about here is that business doesn't just take the UNGPs and a piece of paper and have a checklist, look at a factory and look around. I talked about how you can't see the issues, but that we go deeper. And as I referenced before, we really try to hear workers' voice, hear the voice of the most affected rights holder. You'll hear this reference in the UNGPs as well. And some of us 20 years ago were, well, what was it back 15, 20 years ago, feeding into what became the UNGPs. And the point there is as you don't want to just listen to management. You don't want to listen to workers who were coached and forced by management to lie about their true conditions. So that offsite worker interviewing, that unannounced auditing, the worker helplines, the working with trade unions, these are ways that companies have been learning, but not enough companies do these deeper approaches, especially in the fashion sector, but across retail generally, which is why I'm emphasizing that to you, because that's the improvement in that business human rights due diligence that we all need to be a part of implementing and educating for. So that rigorous monitoring. And then that's a bit more expensive to have multiple assessors, especially always a team with a female, who are interviewing offsite in advance and going deeper and spending more time assessing the conditions or engaging with management to influence and coach how they can improve. And that's why the collaboration again becomes so important. But also what we tend to find is that really, once you know more about this work, you know that many factories are going to find many of the same issues that Dr. Obokata referenced earlier. So the beyond audit work is most important in the fashion industry. We've had some of these programs I mentioned. So the ILO Better Work program has a lot of training for supervisors in apparel factories, for management, other worker training. Fair Wear program do that in Asia as well. The Sustainable Apparel Coalition on the environmental side, but a bit of crossover on health safety. International Accord I referenced, and some of these programs work, the Ethical Trading Initiative as well, work closely with trade unions and try to help management become more comfortable with and understand the benefits of hearing that voice of workers, so that you don't have the friction, the unproductive friction happening in these places that make our clothes. And as sort of other layers to how business do human rights due diligence, I touched on worker helplines, and that's referenced in the UNGPs as grievance mechanisms, communication channels. There are other grievance mechanisms that are fantastic as well. I've just done a lot myself with Handshake out of Guangzhou in China, setting that up with Amadakota in Bangladesh, the worker helpline we set up there, others, and really seeing how that does help workers' voice to be elevated, so that fashion and retail brands are pushed to do more of the actual remediation and potentially even paid more, so that that living wage can ultimately be achieved. And you hear more these days about tech and surveys and smartphones as well. And then a big principle that helped me so much in my time in China was when working with Chinese factories in particular, was if I would say, look, the way we're doing this is ibu, step by step. They really appreciated that, because there's so much coming at suppliers in fashion and other supply chains on quality and deliver on time, but we want a lower price, but we also want you to deliver living wages and better safety and better environmental standards. So that's a big part of what we need to understand, that yes, we all want to see living wage as fast as we can, and yet we need to help supply chains, and I'm referencing that many companies do that, and we also want to see that done step by step up the ladders. I'm not sure how I'm doing on time, but really key principle then is to be rewarding those efforts. So business need to be rewarded by governments and investors. Dr. Obokata talked about, those laws we need. The UK needs business human rights due diligence law. We don't yet have it. So companies here who do the human rights due diligence are not really rewarded yet by UK law. Investors are starting to in the ESG movement. But then what we want to see is that the fashion and other brands reward the suppliers who do that remediation, who have better standards. And that's where we talk about purchasing practices. And the other angle of purchasing practices is not only to reward by paying your suppliers on time, paying them fairly, paying up. So don't just not pay when there's a COVID pandemic and you're a multi-billion-dollar company and these factories are trying to pay their workers. So payupfashion.com if you want to support that standard and movement, but also being careful in the fashion industry because it's fashion. We see a lot of order changes and, oh no, I need it in a different pink, or I want the hem lower, or we need some sparkles here, or the logo should be like this, or no, we can't do 10,000, we can only do 5. And factories are left struggling against fashion buyers in the West who are just not thinking about how this means that suddenly workers need to work overtime, and overtime is supposed to be paid more, and workers are tired, and everything's supposed to be shipped yesterday for this fashion timetable with this crazy marketing program. So that's a massive aspect that is more unique to fashion. That is a problem that we all need to work on. Seeing buyers and fashion designers and merchandisers in the world of fashion brands understanding that their purchasing practices make a massive impact on delivering human rights for the people who make our things in fashion. So companies learn and train their buyers and fashion designers and more with training that organizations like Fair Wear provide, that the UK Ethical Trading Initiative provide, their own internal people like myself would provide, and also assess their internal processes and build that awareness. And then also number 4, try to align incentives and bonuses so that you'll have rules in some companies like Adidas that, if you change your order too many times, that can impact your bonus as a sourcing director, things like that. We talk about critical paths in fashion, that everybody, the whole team, right through from designer to sourcing person, need to stay on this timeline, this critical path. And that even makes an impact for climate action because, if we're not aligning our incentives to those suppliers who are doing the work on better labor standards, safety and environmental, we're not going to get those actions as well. And it really needs to start from the top. So I'll just call out ASOS CEO here, who has spoken publicly, both advocating for, former CEO, advocating for stronger human rights due diligence law in the UK. And, we have some questions, okay. And also, which we need that law, but also they did a lot of work internally on aligning incentives and building awareness and getting critical paths and things going. And then to show our suppliers, particularly in Asia, because we're so far away, that we're doing this work in the UK, because it's not fair. And, what suppliers used to say to me in China or Bangladesh is, what are you guys doing? All this weight on us, all this stress on us. So on the one hand, it's good to listen to our suppliers who are frustrated, but on the other hand, we need to do our work as well, rather than merely telling them they need to improve wages and safety and all sorts of other issues for workers, as in better dormitories and you name it. What are motivations for brands to collaborate in auditing? I would say is reduce cost, share the cost, rather than I pay £1,000 for each audit and I have hundreds of audits to do. If I can get my collaboration going, then we can share that cost, 500 each or 200 each if we had 5 brands, etc. do they not hesitate to disclose their supply chains to competitive brands in fear of their business strategies being stolen? So two different things here. I've worked with many other fashion brands buying from the same factory. So I would identify either by asking my suppliers or just seeing their logos and their garments being made in the factory, who else was being produced in that factory. I would ask the factory if, look, we can reduce the impact on you if you'll allow us to collaborate, and we do that in writing formally on email. And then go back to those brands and say, look, this factory would like us to align and collaborate. And when we're doing it within industry, it's not really, we're not really disclosing our supply chains because we're already walking into the factory and seeing who else make there. And part of how buyers choose factories to produce in is because they're looking at who else the factory makes. It's part of how a factory markets itself to new buyers. So in a way, no. Now, what we have seen, though, is that lower cost fashion industries, and sporting goods started this for almost 20 years now, have been publishing their supplier factory lists for, I'll just call them out, Levi's, Nike, Adidas, Patagonia, H&M for about 20 years. So kudos to all those companies, and Puma. I was in Human Rights Watch when we then caused Gap and a few others to start to do the same. ASOS do as well, for example. What we don't see is the luxury fashion brands, the Gucci, Burberry, Prada, Armani, etc. They don't publish their supplier lists. The irony is, if you walk into a factory in Italy, again, you can see all the brands it's making. They're all, often all making in the same place, although a few like Louis Vuitton own their own factory. But for now, they don't want to disclose their supply chains, and unless there's a bigger advocacy movement, I don't know, or the law requires that. We haven't seen that yet. I hope that answers that question. And what are the main changes in promoting the ratification? I'm going to leave that one to Dr. Obokata. And I'm just going to, I think I'm on my 5 out of 5 slides, which is please speak up for change, because you can be a part of influencing companies to improve, fashion companies. And we talk about fashion as key because we talk about it at the bottom of the pyramid in a way that it's one of the easiest industries. Anyone can buy a sewing machine and start trying to sew and be a home worker. And so it's one of the easiest industries to get into. It's much harder to start making a pharmaceutical drugs factory, for example. So that means that a little less skill is required, although there is a lot of skill, incredible skill in a lot of garment making. And yet, anyone can get into that industry. So we're talking about the fashion industry, but really actually what we just need is change for business human rights due diligence for all supply chain efforts. But you'll see at EU level, EU directive level, there's both that generalized directive under discussion, as well as some specific directives targeted at the fashion industry, just like they have been on timber and other issues. And that speaking up for that structural, that legal change is what is making the biggest difference, which is why I'm stressing this as my final slide. So we've seen that with the UK Modern Slavery Act, pretty toothless, but it sent a message. The German laws having much more impact. So please be a voice for these laws. If you're working in or with a company, show it matters is what I was trying to say, is reward suppliers who make those efforts of improving wages for workers and trying to reduce excessive working hours down from those 80-90 to the 60-70 and then eventually the 50, which, in the West, it's more like a 40. So we've got a long way to go in garment and fashion sector in particular, although that's high season. We do see less sometimes in the lower season. If a country has horrific human rights, companies should be thinking these days with these new human rights due diligence laws about reducing sourcing from there. And in some cases, we saw with Russia, etc., pulling out. And I think we're going to see more of that. I talked about transparency of publishing factory lists and things, but I'll call out the Fair Wear Initiative for the fashion industry here, because they publish reports on apparel brands and how they're doing their human rights due diligence and what they need to improve. So go read one of those. They're amazing. And then there's companies like ASOS, as I mentioned, who are quite transparent about the work they do with Anti-Slavery International and others like that on issues. End Uyghur Forced Labor campaign, I worked with other brands to assess some factories with Uyghur people in forced labor. So this is real. I have interviewed Uyghur workers who were stuck in forced labor. We were influencing remediation. And don't let anybody tell you it's not true, because I've personally seen it on the ground in China, and any brand who speaks up and is honest about that, I admire, and we should encourage, because we need to see that remediated. We need to see freedom for Uyghur people and anyone in forced labor anywhere. My number 3 down here, expect fashion companies to directly advocate and ask for these laws. That's what we should be expecting. It makes a difference. And what we specifically need in the UK is the same human rights due diligence law that the EU has just brought in under the bringing in that UN guiding principles, what the US has on a tariff act. So they've made it illegal to import goods that are alleged to be made under conditions of forced labor with that ILO definition. And the US Customs enforce that all the time right now, especially around cotton for the fashion industry, or any goods made by Uyghur forced labor, but also forced labor in Malaysia or the UK in Leicester, etc., Italy, you name it. And finally, there's a call in the UK that companies should have to report modern slavery incidences and the remediation of those, so that if they didn't, there'd be fines on directors and a real consequence, and we'd actually start to see change. So Centre for Social Justice, or the UK charity Unseen, is where you can read more about that. Not sure if I've gone over time yet, so apologies if I have. But, you know, and in summary, I'm glad you're all studying law, because the law makes such a difference to help cause companies in the fashion sector to have to do due diligence and assessing with integrity and hearing worker voice on what's happening in those supplier factories, and then help influence remediation and help support that with that training and purchasing practices, etc. You know, as you heard from Dr. Obokata, I'm sorry, laws are often not enforced. I've seen that across the board in the West as well. This is not just an Asia issue, but we do see it more in countries with less respect for human rights and less ability for workers to take a case through the courts and hold a company to account. So as human rights in a country deteriorates, so does the ability of workers to enforce their own rights, essentially. But here in the UK, we need to improve things like zero-hours contracts, which disempower workers. And finally, you know, do help rights activists. Awaj Bangladesh, I'll just call them out as a player in Bangladesh who speak up for garment workers as well. You can cause change. And I just wanted to quickly, if I can, jump to, oh, I think it's on here, sorry. The Clean Clothes Campaign website, because I know that when I was preparing for this panel, there was great interest. So I'll just show you here, cleanclothes.org. The UK-based arm is Labour Behind the Label, based in Bristol here in the UK. And they really speak up as a voice for garment workers in Asia. You can see the photos here, and really talk a lot about, advocate for these laws, but also have historically done a lot of very deep reports on what the conditions for garment workers in fashion supply chains really were, which is why we know about these living wage issues, these minimum wage issues, these safety issues, and help cause that accord on fire and building safety, cause a lot more fashion companies to get on with human rights due diligence with more integrity and with that delivering remediation for workers. So to the organizers, have I gone over time yet? I'm not sure. Are you there? Hello?
Yes, but you can feel free to wrap up at your own time.
Yeah. So wrap up slide here. Wonderful that you're all being aware and caring. You know, I hope I've explained, I think, the importance of collaboration. I'm just checking if there were any more questions on that. No, I think I've answered that. But we also want to see a lot of integrity in how fashion companies dig in, and we want to hold fashion companies to account to actually assess properly and really hear workers' voice on what the true conditions are. And what I forgot to say here is that's because in the fashion industry in particular, we've had decades of fake records and workers who were influenced or threatened by managers of factory that they needed to lie about true conditions. And the reason factories are doing that is because fashion brands have been saying, oh, if you don't comply with all these standards, then we're going to end business. And so that's where number 4 becomes important, that we need fashion buyers to reward honesty by their suppliers and allowing workers to speak the truth. And then as fashion buyers to support those suppliers to understand how to improve and to do that ibu step-by-step improvement. So we used to do lots of trainings with our suppliers. And this is where the collaboration becomes important again, because it's expensive to do lots of trainings and things. So something like the ILO Better Work program is an example. You can look on their website of brands coming together and aligning their resources so that factories don't get confused and overwhelmed. They get one clear message. They do that training. They do that step-by-step improvement. It has integrity because we're all respecting and we're rewarding that step-by-step. And in the background, we're speaking up that more brands should join those programs like ILO Better Work and Fair Wear, which help cause those improvements, those real life. And I'll finally say we really do cause real life improvements for workers and supply chains when we do this work, which is why I'm on this call, because I'm passionate about it, because I know it makes a difference. So I'm glad many of you are looking at coming into this industry, and thank you. And feel free to contact me on LinkedIn or wherever anytime. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Larsen, for insightful presentation on garment workers' working conditions through sharing your experiences working in Asia. And it was very helpful that we get to learn about how we can keep corporates accountable for responsible sourcing and human rights compliance, but also to be more conscious of our own purchasing power and how we can personally also advocate and contribute to improve these conditions in the industry. Thank you. So now for our next speaker, we are happy to welcome Mr. Wiranta Ginting, Deputy International Coordinator for the Asia Floor Wage Alliance. Mr. Ginting is a seasoned organizer and labor rights educator with over 20 years of experience working with trade unions and grassroots NGOs in Southeast Asia. He has led successful campaigns for decent work and living wages in global fashion supply chains, and will be sharing his expertise on these important issues with us today. Mr. Ginting, please. Thank you.
Thank you. I don't have a PowerPoint to share with you guys, but I will just explain what that we are doing in Asia Floor Wage. Again, it's like, thank you. It's really great to be here. Thank you for inviting Asia Floor Wage to be part of this conference. The committee asked me to discuss on living wage, but I think the living wage is really compact. And then once we unpack the living wage, it will touch everything. So I think it will be like here and there touching many issues. Asia Floor Wage is an Asian labor-led global labor and social alliance across garment producing countries in Asia and consumer regions of USA and then Europe. We found these organizations in 2017. Asia Floor Wage aims to build regional unity among Asian garment unions to overcome the limitations of country-based struggles in the global production network and hold global fashion brands accountable. Asia Floor Wage historic cross-border living wage formulations for Asian garment workers is also the only women-centered formulations of its kind. In Asia, we are in Indonesia, Cambodia, Myanmar, in Southeast Asia. And then in South Asia, we are in Bangladesh, India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka. So as an alliance, we work closely with the trade union members and then also labor rights organizations in these countries. So that's Asia Floor Wage. So we have now about more than 50 trade unions and labor rights organizations in the alliance. I would like to start with more like reiterate what Dr. Obokata and then Kate have explained in detail. So one things that we know for sure, if we are doing readings about development discourse and anything, kind of like integrations to the global supply chains is a way to have rapid industrial developments. And then in many literatures, kind of like global apparel supply chain as a pathway to economic growth and development for decades. It's been promoted like that. I mean, if you want to have like economic growth, you want to have like end of unemployment, create more employment. I mean, like just do the apparel, join the global apparel supply chains and then that kind of things. But it's been recommended also by OECD, by the World Bank, policymakers, academics also. But the ground situation, I mean, and this has been happening for years, for decades. Like this is the way to the economic growth. This is the way to have more futures, better living conditions, kind of like that. But the ground situations is we all know. So, I mean, for us who've been working with trade unions, working with the labor rights organizations, we know garment sector is notorious with its terrible working conditions, which has all been detailed by Dr. Obokata in his presentations, like poverty level wages, long working hours, unsafe and unhealthy conditions, job insecurity, gender-based violence and harassment. And then this happens not only 1 year, I mean, it also happens for decades. So there is like contradictions there where it's been promoted as a way to economic growth, but in the reality, women workers, garment women workers, I mean, like majority of the workers in the garment sector is like 60 to 80% are women workers. So these women workers never graduate from the poverty levels, kind of like they stuck in the poverty levels. So that's what I also want to say, like one reasons, I mean, like in the analysis, one reasons why garment industry, why the brands has been growing so much is because this is also echo what Kate already explained before, like the global supply chain is unregulated. Because this is unregulated, there is no way for the brands, I mean, like in Asia Floorweights, we call brands not as a buyer, we call brands as a principal employer. Principal employer means like they have the most power in the global supply chain. They control the global supply chains. And then because, I mean, there is no regulations that can touch the brands as a principal employer, I mean, there is no jurisdictions can hold them legally liable, accountable in the global supply chains. So for any labor rights violations, they can just don't care. They can just avoid it. I mean, like there is no legal jurisdictions on that can hold them accountable. So with this unregulated global supply chains, the brands can squeeze and then earn super profit from the extreme exploitations of workers. So, and then that's why, I mean, like the global garment supply chains right now is just a tool to replicate inequality. And then what we learned from the COVID-19 crisis situation is not just replicate inequality, it exacerbated also the pre-existing inequalities, especially economic violence against women and deepening gender disparity. So, I mean, that's why, I mean, in Asia Floorweights, we've been thinking, I mean, we've been in our agenda is, I mean, like we need to regulate the global supply chain. I mean, this effort, this initiative has started in many countries, in many parts of the world. Like in the US, if you guys aware about the Garment Workers Protection Act in California, it's really great because, I mean, it really put joint employer liability. The suppliers and the brands are both jointly liable for the labor rights violations. This is something that we need as a way how we need to regulate the global supply chain. And then also like in the Europe, I mean, there is also a call, I mean, the movement in the European activists, I mean, like movement now calling for the European Commissions to have like human rights due diligence on living wage. The ECI campaign, I mean, done also by CCC Network, which is Kate explained in her presentations also. And then that's one way. I mean, like there are many more initiatives, like the Germany Supply Chains Act, and then we are now trying to regulate the supply chains because, I mean, if it is not being regulated, it will just like a jungle where brands can do whatever they want and then they just run away with the labor rights violations and then squeeze the super profit from the extreme exploitations from the workers. Another way also how we can regulate the supply chains is through the enforceable brand agreement, a binding agreement with the brands. So for examples, like, I think you are aware with this is the collapse of Rana Plaza, more than thousands of workers dead because there is no standard, there is no assessment, there is no evaluation. And then after this collapse, and then we, the global government workers' right movement, push the brands and then push, we have the binding agreements on the Bangladesh Accord. The same with recently, Asia Florweights won a Dindigul agreement. These Dindigul agreements came after the rape and murders of a young girls coming from Dalit community in India, which is then it also show like there is now, it reached a limit that we talk about corporate social responsibility, voluntary initiative, social audit. It reached its limits. It's not sufficient anymore. We need a binding agreement for a way to regulate so we can hold the brands, the principal employers in the global supply chain accountable for labor rights violations. And then that's also apply in the living wage context. Living wage, this is one of the key issue in garment sector. And then the way we are, Asia Florweights along with CCC, WSRN, we are coming together. We are campaigning on the living wage for garment workers, not only in Asia, but also in Eastern Europe. We are demanding living wages for all garment workers. So the way we are proposing is also like the living wages is also should be enforceable wage agreement. So brands should be enforced. This agreement, the living wage should be enforced. By in every countries, and then the workers can enjoy the living wage. So this is also a way we regulate. We want to regulate the living wage. ILO has been discussing about decent work for some times, and then but I think the conventions or anything about the decent work is not there yet. So that's why we need to have a decent work in the global supply chains, and then we need the regulator on that. And then, so we are talking about wages, living wages. Until now, there is no common accepted definitions of living wages until now. We are in Asia Florweights define living wages should be capable of supporting workers' family to meet their basic needs. Workers' family, not individual workers. Workers' family to supporting their basic needs to ensure that their children receive education so that they have opportunity to rise out of poverty and meet the minimum requirement for decent life. This Asia Florweights formulations of living wage is also, we adopt also a feminist approach. The Asia Florweights formulations is a women-centered formulations. It is based on a single earner family with dependents in order to include within its costing the unpaid household work, including care work that is critical for a family, and then it's mostly even today done by women. So the living wage concept of Asia Florweights also adopt this feminist approach to compensate the household work, the care work costs. So how we've been doing, how do we see the living wage and then the minimum wage? We've been doing survey since its foundations in 2007. We developed the formula of the living wage concept of Asia Florweights. And then for that, we do for food basket survey regularly. We survey the consumptions of the workers. So from this, since 2008, 2009 survey that we did with workers in the garment workers, we have consistent finding. Like in all countries that we did the survey, the calorie intake is lower than the standard of the poverty calorie intake standard by the World Bank. The calorie World Bank's poverty standard by World Bank is 2,400 kilocalorie. And then from our survey consistently, like with the minimum wage, with the wage paid by the company to the workers, they cannot meet the 2,400 calorie. That's why the terms like minimum wage is a poverty wage is still relevant, is still happening until now in the garment global supply chain. And then now, I mean, like ILO released, I think 2 years ago, released the report, like the minimum wage also based on the calorie about 2,950. It is still far. I mean, like, so that's what happens in the wages of the workers in the, I mean, garment workers in the global supply chain in Asia. I mean, poverty wages is real. Workers cannot meet their daily needs. Workers cannot support their family without having to have like additional income in the family. So how do we calculate, I mean, the concept of Asia floor wage? So we calculate the cost of food, we call it the food cost, and then the cost of non-food items. So we have this ratio, I mean, like once we have the food cost, and then we will kind of like use the ratio, I mean, by the governments or, and then recently we do survey not only for food consumptions, but also non-food consumptions. And then from our research in 2022, we found like the ratio on average is about 45 to 55, 45 to food consumption costs, and then 55 to non-food consumption costs. And then we take the considerations, like, I mean, because I mean, the feminist approach, and then the consumptions unit is like one family is 3 consumption unit, which children is only half consumptions unit. So in Asia floor wage, we have 3 consumptions unit. That's, I mean, like, that's how we calculate. And then that's how we know, I mean, like, the calorie is like the unit to measures, and then that's how we count. Now we understand like garment workers have not received even the poverty calorie level of from the World Bank standard. So this is what happened, I mean, like in the wage. That's why, I mean, like we are in Asia floor wage demanding, we are promoting the living wage concepts, and then also we are demanding the living wage concepts. We want workers to live in a better situations, in a more dignity situations. The need for living wage has become stronger now because, I mean, like after we experience COVID-19 crisis, it is kind of like people say, like, I mean, people have like the same common argument, like if workers being paid living wage, at least they will have some buffer to meet their costs during COVID situations. But because wages were at poverty level before the pandemic, and then the COVID situation pushed them further below the poverty line. And then that's why, I mean, the demand for living wage is become stronger now. And then household income also fell. I mean, like, even if we took the standard of living wage of Asia floor wage, I mean, the gap of the living wage of with Asia floor wage standards, and then the situation, like, no, it's become bigger. The situation is also because wages have been stagnant. Garment worker wages has been stagnant for many years, for lifetime of workers. So if profit getting bigger, getting higher, and then being increased, but wages has been stagnant. So I mean, that's why the worker situations is like really, really in terrible situations, getting worse during COVID. And then they now fall into debt to finance because, and then they also need to reduce consumptions of food, nutrition, housing, education, healthcare. They reduce that kind of it during the crisis. And then it's not only about the workers who experience and their family, it's also about their children. So the impact can be like intergenerational impact for what the unpaid of the living wages. So in 2020, we did survey more than 2,000 workers in 189 factories from the 6 countries in South Asia and Southeast Asia. We estimate about $164 million like being stolen from the workers because they are not receiving legal minimum wage. We are not talking about living wage. They're not receiving the legal minimum wage, which is, if we refer to the ILO convention definitions, the minimum wage should not be reduced by any kind of agreement or any kind of contract. The thing is, it's now we are in the situations where we can say COVID is over or almost over. Like And then we revisit the situations from the 189 factory, we take like 41 factories. And then we found like 9 in 10 factory have not resolved workers' wage claim from 2020. And then this is from the 41 factories, it's about 71 millions of wage staff. And then more than half of factories not paying workers overtime since 2020 onward. And then 1 in factories are not paying workers minimum wage or all benefits. So before pandemic, the situation is already bad. Pandemic make it situations making worse. And then the unpayment of living wage, the non-payment of living wage, making workers go in deeper in the poverty levels. And then we are not talking about COVID-19 crisis. And now crisis will keep coming. Now we experience the global economic crisis. In Indonesia, in Cambodia, in many other, in Pakistan, we receive report from trade unions that suppliers now reducing the numbers of workers because of the global crisis. Due to the global crisis, terminations, layoff is now happening again. And then workers in Indonesia just recently, about yesterday, the ministry released a circular that it is okay for the suppliers, export-oriented supplier, to cut wages 25%. So this is crazy. Like the poverty level wages being suppressed and suppressed again, and then it is the government's also supporting it. So that's what's going on with the situations. And then in Pakistan, the climate crisis, I think you are aware about the flood in Pakistan, few months ago. In Sri Lanka, the crisis is political crisis and an economic crisis. So every crisis, the brands can earn like super profit, and then the cost of the crisis being pushed to the suppliers, and then supplier push it to the workers. So at the end, it is the workers who will take the burn of the crisis. And then, so these things need to stop. That's why like in a campaign now, Fight the Highs, we want to end wage theft, because we need to stop doing wage theft even in crisis. So crisis, crisis happens as experienced by all people, but it shouldn't be workers to take the impact by themselves. So that's what we learned. So like in that situations, in general, like basic and labor human rights of garment workers in Asia, like has been historically been violated within the global apparel supply chains. Workers' wages determine the ability of their household to survive. So if the wages low, the survivals of the workers' family is also getting lower. These wages are subject to market clearing forces in labor surplus economy, which push them below even poverty level legal minimum wage. And then on the other side, brands are able to accumulate extreme profit by passing on the risk and costs associated with the production based on fluctuating demand in volatile apparel market to workers. That's the situations. They pass on the cost of cheap manufacturing to workers in the form of employment, low wages, lack of liability for non-enforcement of labor standard. So this is the situations in the global garment supply chains. This is what happened. Wages and labor rights in general, it is a human rights. Fundamental wages and labor rights fundamental in ensuring that human rights are safeguarded. So if we go to the Universal Declarations of Human Rights, right to just and favorable remunerations, ensure an existence worthy of human dignity, right to a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being of his and his family. So it's living wages is a human rights. It's right to have a decent living. No, and then in many countries, this, I'm just explaining about the situations in Indonesia just yesterday. Like the government, the Ministry of Manpower passed a new circulars that allow the export-oriented supplier to cut wages and up to 25%. And then this is this is crazy. I mean, like, this is why we need to come together. This is why we need to have like a strong regulations. Because I mean, if we are talking about wages, if we are talking about either minimum wages or living wages, we are talking about redistribution. It is now being accumulated into the view of the people that own the brands. Like, I mean, in Fight the Heights campaign, we are also targeting the CEO of the brands, because what they do, like, they do buyback, and then the buyback goes to the owners of the company. I mean, like in Nike, I mean, we filed an OECD complaint last month on Nike, because if we calculate the amount of money that they allocate for the buyback, it can pay, I mean, about 2,000 times of the wage claim of the Nike garment workers in the supply chains. So if we are talking about, it's not something that paying wages, paying living wages, paying minimum wages is not something that the brands cannot do. The capacity is there. It's just like the state and business, they have the obligations to respect and protect the human rights, because I mean, living wage is a human rights. They have the obligation to protect to the living wage as human rights, but the brands, they are avoiding it. They have lack of willing.
Sorry for interrupting you, but I wanted to ask if you could close so we can have time for our panel discussion. I'm so sorry.
Sure. So I just want to close it with like, because I mean, I've been asked how the living wage relate to the economic, cultural, social right. Unpayment of living wage is really close to the right to life. I mean, and what we are discussing, what we are experienced during COVID is like, because they are not getting paid, their wages being cut. I mean, their life is in threat, the workers' life in threat. And then the living wages, paying living wages is too close to the right to equal opportunity. In the garment sector, majority of the women workers, we know, like, I mean, like, this should be empower women, and then to make like close the gender pay gap because of this minimum wage. And then also the right to protections of the law. Without these wages, the living wages being enforced in the binding agreement, there is no guarantee that living workers are being paid living wages. And then also right to work. So these wages is also part of the giving workers, I mean, right to work. And then a standard of living adequate for himself and then his family. Decent work is for all. I mean, like, that's why, I mean, like, people support it. And then the way it's, because I mean, it's also human rights for all people. So the garment workers is also entitled for that rights. I will stop there and then we can discuss more. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Wiranta, for that presentation about the work of Asia Floor Wage Campaign and the trade unions in your alliance, and especially for highlighting the role of this industry in replicating inequality, violence against women, and gender disparity, especially during the pandemic. It's been very confronting, but much needed to hear about the realities of what has been occurring at the policy level in different countries in Southeast Asia and South Asia. So thank you so much for that. So our speakers has provided us with valuable insights into the working conditions and wages of garment workers in Asia. Now we will have a panel discussion to delve even deeper into the topic with all our speakers. We encourage you to participate in this discussion by asking questions in the chat. And we are honored to have Dr. Katya from Essex Law School to moderate this discussion. She is a senior research officer at Essex Law School and has expertise in the military use of brain-computer interfaces and the law of armed conflict. So Dr. Katya, the floor is yours. Welcome and thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Erica. It's been a pleasure to be part of this panel with such really amazing speakers. It was very thought-provoking for somebody who's not necessarily an expert on these things. I have loads of questions. I would like to use my prerogative as a moderator to start with my own questions, but I'm going to reserve it because I think our audience deserve to ask before me. So I would take the questions that have been posted anonymously in the Q&A, and the first one is what are the main challenges in promoting the ratification and the application of international norms, such as the Forced Labor Convention by countries? I think I would leave this question open. Whoever would like to answer this, you're more than welcome.
I'm happy to kind of jump in there. I mean, there's different levels of challenges. First of all, I mean, there may be a law against forced labor and whatnot, but the enforcement is an issue, as I might have said. So that may be a lack of political will on the part of the government, or there's a power relations between the businesses who yields enormous powers over, so I mean, they can threaten to withdraw their factories, and that would result in unemployment. So oftentimes the government turns a blind eye. And also, this what I've also discovered through my work is that the labor inspection is very weak. I mean, it is almost impossible to have a labor inspector in every single factory every single day. That's not possible. And then businesses do take advantage of that, and I think that needs to stop. So I always call upon governments to strengthen labor inspection on the proper and unannounced one is better, because I've also heard the stories where all these factories are informed in advance that, okay, we are coming on this day and this time. I mean, they'll tell workers to go away during that time, or they'll give them a statement, and so they tell them what to say. I mean, you have no effectiveness there. And also, we also need to, we're talking about supply and so on, but we also have to consider the demand of it. I mean, why do they keep producing this cheap clothing? Because there's a strong demand for cheap in a consumer country like UK. If you're a student, you want to have a cheap clothing from, I don't know, Primark or Boohoo.com and so on. As long as you keep demanding those cheap goods and services, I mean, and then so we also have to, that also raises the question as to what we as consumers should do to prevent. So it's not just the responsibility of the government. That's first and foremost, yes, it is the responsibility of businesses, but what can we do as consumers to prevent? So I think that's something that we should all think about. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. I would like to add a couple of points to this, actually, from this perspective. So there is more of a growing attention in the past decade on actually non-state actors and their role in forming and shaping international law. And non-state actors now could be massive companies such as Macintosh, McDonald's, and so all the practice, they are so huge and powerful that if they want to be a positive force and actually trying and change these practices, they would be able to. So more pressure from the part of the consumer would do great. But then on the other hand, I see it myself when I go to buy something, and then they say sustainable and ethical, and it's like a green label. And then I think the last thing I saw was a price of 2 pillowcases for £90. And I looked at it and I thought, I actually wrote to the company and I said, you're buying ethically sourced products contingent upon being rich. That's more or less trying to say only rich people can afford to be ethical, and that kind of creates a sentiment on the part of the consumer. I don't have the resources to be ethical. I don't care.
I want to pick up on that one. Yeah.
Yeah, please go ahead.
This is why I kept talking about laws. So you've referenced that power of a McDonald's or a multinational. Dr. Obokata mentioned, the growth of Boohoo or Shein, etc. And you, as a customer, Katya, is it Dr. Alkhateeb? You should not have to know. Just like when you buy a car, you don't worry about, oh, is the safety okay? Like, you do a little bit, but you don't have to go around and research for hours and figure out, is there a seatbelt in every car that I'm trying? It's the law that all cars have to have seatbelts to certain safety standards, and we just expect that. And the way the wheels should be fitted in a way that's not going to come off, and all these hundreds of other safety standards. That's what we should expect on how companies do due diligence on supply chains, that when you walk into a shop and you go to buy, you don't have to try to search on 3 different apps and figure out which brand should I even walk into this shop, which product should I buy, which brand. We do have some legislation already, as I say, safety standards, but also environmental, plastic packaging around what companies need to provide when they offer a service. But we don't, in the UK, for example, have any legislation right now that says that companies need to have assessed their supply chains for whether workers are being paid properly and treated properly, to have done the actually influencing, improving that, and the remediation and the publishing of all of that. And if they're required to do that by the law, then you don't need to worry about it. This is, I think, one of the biggest messages I hope that the 3 of us speakers are trying to get through, which is that you shouldn't have to think about that. Now, right now, use an app or watch Oxfam or listen to Oxfam Behind the Brands or label behind the label, and which brands they call out, like Shein or Boohoo, who are undercutting and not doing as much as Marks and Spencer and ASOS. But the reality is, you can't tell, is H&M good, is H&M bad, is Primark good, Primark bad. It depends you shouldn't have to try to figure that out. You should be able to go shopping and know that companies are required by the law of this country, as Germany has already brought in, France has already brought in, and then, as Dr. Obokata mentions, is enforced on those companies, and civil society can take cases against those companies to make sure that people were paid properly when they made the things that we go to buy. And that may raise some of those prices beyond a $2 t-shirt to a $3 t-shirt, and that's fine. The playing field is leveling.
Exactly, this is what I'm trying to say, but there has to be also regulation over the pricing of this product and not create a culture that makes people, you can't.
If the due diligence was done, the price will
be
itself.
Yes, because we don't want to.
Companies are undercutting right now. Shein has come in, for example, after Boohoo, because H&M and Primark have been spending a bit more for 10, 15, 20 years now on doing a lot more in supply chains. There in ILO Better Work and Act and the Accord and you name it. And yet Shein has done none of that until 6 months ago when we started to make a noise. But we shouldn't have to make a noise about every new brand on the market after workers are exploited. It should be the law that to be a brand on the market, you were meant to do those things in the first place.
Thank you, Kate. Mr. Wiranta, please.
Yeah, I just also want to add also, it's not only regulations in the home brands, home countries, but also in the productions countries. Right. It should be like trade unions in Indonesia, for example, can go and then file a case of name any international brands in this Indonesian national legal system. So it can be like both sides. I mean, like brands home countries and then also the productions countries where the products is being made. So it can be like it will give pressures, and then the brands can be held accountables on it. So that's this. I mean, I'm just also adding one example. Like recently, I mean, in US there is after the Uyghur case. I mean, they have like a forced labor act, and then it's just recently. The Eastman, I mean, like one of the suppliers in India, I mean, because they got report, I mean, the Custom Border Patrol of US received report there is a forced labors in this factory, and then because of that, they've been banned, their import being banned. So I mean, like collaborations, regulations, due diligence, you need to work with the trade unions for sure. It's not something for the benefits only for the trade unions, for the workers, but it is also benefit. I mean, it works, it benefits also the brands, because I mean, they will avoid this kind of banning from the exporting countries, home countries. That kind of stuff.
Thank you. We have another question, if I may ask our panelists. What are motivations for brands to collaborate in auditing, remediating, or align their labor standards? Do they not hesitate to disclose their supply chains to their competitive? Somebody.
Yeah, so I did have a go at answering this before.
Yes.
Can you post it again? Because it's quite a lengthy question. It's just whether we have any more to add maybe, or if that person needed any more clarification after. But essentially motivations are, there's so, you know more about your supplier, you can more fairly compare factories. Let's say we're doing jeans, and you'll often see brands trying to produce jeans in 5 to 10 factories, because just in case there was a flood in Pakistan and that factory couldn't ship, the market expects jeans. And so you'll be producing in multiple factories in multiple countries. And so they're sort of competing on price, quality, shipping, but also labor and environmental standards, hopefully. And so you end up with these hundreds of factories, and it's expensive, as I said, to do the integrity of actually assessing properly and hearing what are the true conditions, and to help rank suppliers on their labor performance, for example. And so collaborating, you can share the cost, you can learn more about what's happening in your suppliers. And the suppliers, in my experience in China and Thailand and Japan and other countries, really appreciated when we aligned our standards. We didn't send them multiple checklists, Disney wants this and Burberry wants that and Adidas wants that, and you actually kind of want the same thing but slightly different. The classic one is that factories used to complain that Adidas and Nike at one point, they asked for the fire extinguisher to be at this height, and the other brand wanted it at that height in the same factory. And so when Adidas come to audit, we put the fire extinguisher, it's a silly, ridiculous situation that got fixed very fast. But it shows you how, if we don't align our standards, we have these unintended consequences happening in the supply chain that don't help workers, don't help factories, don't help brands, don't help anybody. So we need to align our standards, align our assessing, align our engaging for remediation, because if I introduce a worker helpline program in my brand program and you introduce a different worker helpline program, the workers are confused now, and it doesn't help workers as much either. So those are some of the motivations on not just standards, but the work is more important. And then I think I talked earlier about the hesitating to disclose. Well, there's probably over 100 brands these days who publish their supplier factory lists already, quarterly, or 2 to 4 times annually anyway. And as I said, it's really at the moment just the luxury fashion brands who don't. And they hesitate, but in a way they shouldn't, because you can walk into a factory or meet a factory owner in Italy and find out pretty fast where everybody produces anyway.
Of course, thank you. If I may ask Dr. Tomoya, in terms of accountability, where we are in terms of accountability. For example, I know in Syria, where I'm from, Lafarge has been actually found guilty of human rights violations in the country because they decided to buy eventually from a group that funded kind of terrorism. And I know that there's an outstanding, I don't know if it's finished, Shell in Nigeria that there was a big lawsuit there also about exploiting the environment as well as the workers. So where are we in terms of accountability? Are there systems, assessments or systems in check? What are the wins that we have used so far and that we can capitalize on going forward?
The accountability certainly is an issue, I suppose. Again, enforcement of it's very difficult to an extent, I suppose. I take that. Even in fashion industry, I don't know, the other two speakers may also have a first-hand experience of companies either complying with all of these, that whether it is guiding principles or national legislation, and not if they don't comply, then what are their consequences? If there are no consequences, then it's not much of a point, and it doesn't give you an incentive. Like UK's Modern Slavery Act, yes, you can just write a statement, but and that's about it. And that can be a cutting and pasting, an exercise. There. Then I think I was just reading the question about this human rights due diligence and on the box, and that also relates to that. Okay, the move towards mandatory human rights due diligence, is that going to be effective if there are no, for example, like monitoring and enforcement mechanisms? I think that's a very good question. Certain laws in Europe, I think France or Germany, and there are consequences. So you'll be, for example, fined, or there's a criminal prosecution against directors and things like that. So there, with that kind of legal consequences, then that may encourage the accountability side of things. But I do also think that particularly these fashion brands do actually care about the image as well. So it's wrong to say that, oh, all of their factories or brands are bad. I mean, it's widespread, but I mean, again, once they damage their reputation, they're not going to be able to sell their clothes. So then what's going to happen? I think consumers are not stupid. I think they are quite smart. They can choose. And as you say, there's a strong nowadays movement towards consumer boycott, which I think is can be a good thing. But we also have to kind of finally consider the consequences of human rights due diligence. Does that actually enhance the right of workers if the law only applies to only 1% of the companies, as in EU directive? I mean, it doesn't apply to small companies. And what about outsourcing? Because I mean, if you have a supply chain, and so nowadays, companies are just outsourcing. So use company that is totally separate and to produce these things, and that law necessarily don't apply to this practice of outsourcing. So there are certain issues that we also be careful. We have to be careful about human rights due diligence, how that can be enforced effectively. So sorry, I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you.
I think Wiranta gave some good examples of accountability being delivered recently. I think he and I are both following quite closely the USA's Tariff Act and the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, both of which, under which the US government actually provides grants to civil society to investigate for forced labor cases in supply chains of importers to the USA, and then make those reports to US Customs. And this week, US Customs did a webinar updating that they've made thousands of seizures of product coming into the USA, about, I think maybe about 30% of which was apparel, so fashion.
Yes.
Around allegations that, so they've seized those physical imports and then are holding those importers to account that if you cannot prove that those products were not made under forced labor conditions, they cannot enter the USA. And then they also are pushing that it can't just be shipped to some other country. And then to Dr. Obokata's point on small companies, is a really great point you raised. At least in the USA, now that legislation came into effect a year or two ago, they're now saying we need to expand it to small shipments, which were under the legal bar. So as these laws come in, we start to do what Dr. Obokata is mentioning, which is improve them and look at widening their scope and making sure you don't have loopholes where people can get away with it. So I think we are seeing some accountability. We're seeing US brands freak out about, wow, I really need to check for forced labor in my global supply chains and make sure it's either not there or where I find it, I influence remediation. And that might mean I need to pay my suppliers better. Wow, and move towards a living wage, as Wiranta has mentioned. But then also on the legal side, we see governments going, okay, we started this new law, it's not working, we're going to improve, or at least it's working, but only in part, and we need to improve it and enforce it better, as Dr. Obokata mentioned.
Thank you. Mr. Wiranta, would you like to say something?
Yeah, I also want to add, the forced labor, the core idea, one of the core idea is coercions. And then coercions only take place when workers doesn't have enough powers. And then the only, way to workers to have enough powers is by unionizing. So, that's kind of like, this global supply chains is organized with with the explanations, like the PowerPoint from Dr. Obokata, is kind of like this global garment supply chains is kind of like basically forced labor situations where workers being trapped every time. Because if they don't follow, they will be their contract will not continue. And then if they unionize, and then they will terminate it immediately. That kind of situations, and then that weaken the workers' powers. So that's kind of like, that's why it is important of freedom associations. It's important the role of unions. So it's not just kind of like a brand's initiative. It should be collaborate with the trade unions. It will not work if only top-down approach. It should be also coming from the trade unions perspective, involved in the process of due diligence. Like, what happens in the Dindigul agreements is trade unions really play an active role in ending the gender-based violence in the Eastman factories. That's really, we need to also think trade unions as a key component, key actors in ending, in making global supply chains more better.
And there's a few ways that fashion brands are physically doing that. So joining the International Accord on Fire and Building Safety from originally Bangladesh, now Pakistan, hopefully more countries. The industrial global frameworks that H&M and Inditex, Zara, and a few others have committed to, although it hasn't been busy lately, but in principle, they've committed to support trade unions in their global supply chains. The ACT initiative with industrial global framework, global unions. And then with the ILO Better Work program will only come into a country when it is around, to this point on earlier about those laws coming in countries that the country will allow freedom of association, collective bargaining, and then support trade unions. So Vietnam's kind of example of where that's been difficult in a communist environment, but it's nevertheless, actually, we have seen a bit of empowerment of worker trade unions by brands paying to join the ILO Better Work program, and that then being able to work with the government and improve labor inspector capacity.
Thank you, Kate. We are running over time, but I'm going to do one last thing. I'm going to read 3 questions that the audience have directed to us, and I'm going to give you a chance to, for each one of you to pick a question and actually speak to it. I think some of these questions we've already answered, but just to give us a chance to actually speak to some of the concerns mentioned. So the first one is the due diligence one, but I will read it out loud. This participant said, I appreciate and agree with the discussion around the need for mandatory human rights due diligence legislation to regulate business. However, is there a risk that the trend towards due diligence laws with a lack of monitoring and enforcement mechanisms would increase business reputations without actual change in the labor conditions? This is number one. The second question is whether you think that we should legislate or legislation should be for certain ratio between the highest paid CEO, investors and owners, and the lowest paid workers in value chains. And the third and final question would be, what are motivations for brands to collaborate in auditing or remediating or to align their labor standards? Do they not hesitate to disclose their supply chains to their competitive brands in fear of their business strategies getting stopped? I think we kind of answered these concerns more or less, but is there anything you would like to add to any of these questions before we wrap up?
I want to answer also questions from Kate, like, I mean, legislate a certain ratio between highest paid CEO. It's in general like this. I mean, buyback is not healthy for the economy. It's not healthy for the economic of the country. It's kind of like only showing buyback to pay the investor, to pay the CEO. It's only a show of like extreme greed, the stock buyback situations. I mean, like extreme greed of the few people. So it should be. And then it's not making the industry getting better, because it's not reinvest again to the industry, but it's for the paying of the people. So it's not helping. So I mean, that's what I just want to add on that question. So we need to regulate. I mean, we can discuss more. I mean, but yeah, it will be also important to have the regulations on of money that can.
Anything you think states should be doing to more in terms of, like, I know for a fact that Germany, in terms of the health sector, they are trying to reduce tax on bioproducts and increase tax on high sugar content products, and they are trying to talk about, you know, the rights and human rights of the consumer. I should be able to decide what I want to eat rather than being goaded by the government to eat less sugar and, you know, more healthy food. So there are lots of things that the government is doing positively, so to speak, by reducing tax. Do you think there is more stuff states should be actually doing in order to encourage these ethical practices?
I just want to sort of combine an answer to that with an answer to the question, very good question, on do we risk greenwash, sort of social wash, by human rights due diligence law focus? It depends how the law is crafted. So if the law requiring companies to do human rights due diligence on their supply chains requires that they collaborate, requires that they engage trade unions, requires that they respect freedom of association and collective bargaining, requires that they're transparent in publishing their lists, requires that they do assessments with integrity, and that they are assessed by initiatives like Fairware, which rigorously look at their purchasing practices. I mean, for example, the EU CSDD right now had the word purchasing practices removed from it at one stage. So, you know, this is the debate we're in of it could be greenwash, these human rights due diligence laws, if they don't require the steps that we have learned in the past 20, 25 years can help deliver due diligence. If we just have a tick box exercise, yes, it could be. But if we actually all advocate together, if you join Clean Cloth Campaign or Labor Behind the Label or Oxfam or whatever, and help them, Human Rights Watch, etc., to advocate into the crafting of these laws so that they require companies to do the bits that actually help support workers to come together and collectively bargain and to raise those conditions and wage levels, then we'll see results. And so that's why we're all on these calls, because that's the work that needs to be done.
Thank you, Kate. I think we are coming to an end. So thank you. Big thanks to our panelists for amazing interventions and contributions today. I think that was one of the most thought-provoking sessions I've attended this year, and I'm sure our audience also agrees to that. There are more questions coming in, but unfortunately we are unable to attend to all of them. Thank you all so very much for giving up your time to be here. It's been an absolute pleasure, and thank you for the student committee and Dr. Sanai Fujita for actually organizing all of this and making me a small part of it. It's been great. I will give up the floor to probably Dr. Sanai if you would like to say something before we finish up.
Yeah, thank you very much for this excellent discussion, and Katya for joining us as a moderator to support student team. And I think that student want to wrap up probably. Yeah, Ima, it's for you.
Thank you, Dr. Fujita. We are grateful for your attendance today, and we would like to express our sincere appreciation to Dr. Katya Alkhateeb, Dr. Tomoya Obokata, Ms. Kate Larsen, and Mr. Wiranta Ginting for their valuable contributions to the conference. Myself, I've enjoyed it quite a lot, and I'm pretty sure all of our attendees have as well. We invite you to join us again for part 2 of the conference on Saturday, 25th of March at the same time at 10 a.m. UK time. During this session, we will delve deeper into the business and human rights aspects of our topic, explore the labor markup in the industry, and discuss the role of companies in promoting sustainable and responsible practices that adhere to international human rights standards. We value your feedback, and we'll appreciate it if you could take a moment to fill out the feedback form that we have provided. Your insights and suggestions will help us improve future conference. Thank you so much.